So let's start with a brief description of how hope is a problem for Buddhism. Um, what we find in Buddhism is that people often see it, particularly in Western contexts, as a fairly nihilistic or sometimes quite despairing philosophical system. And people often, with a kind of cursory understanding of Buddhism, will point to a couple of things and say, look, the basis of Buddhism, the kind of foundations of Buddhism are what we call the Four Noble Truths. And the first of the Noble Truths, if we gloss it in a kind of crude way, is something like life is suffering. So if that's the first foundational truth of how we live our lives, it's not a sort of super, it doesn't seem to be a sort of super hopeful, life-affirming kind of position. Another place we might go right in those kind of foundations is the Buddha's first substantive teaching is actually called the Fire Sermon. And in the Fire Sermon, he tells us that the world is on fire. And he means this both in a kind of literal sense that all kinds of awful things are happening in the world all the time, and also in a metaphorical sense. That is, no matter how we engage with the world, no matter what we think about how the world functions, it's always functioning in a way that's causing suffering in the manner that something that is on fire will always blaze. So if we can't see that fire, that is, if we live in the world as though that's not how it is, then in that kind of Buddhist diagnosis, we're just misknowing. That is, we're seeing or knowing the world incorrectly. So we can see maybe how in these kind of foundations of Buddhist philosophy, we get a bit of a sense that Buddhism isn't very jolly or life-affirming. And then, 20th century Buddhist masters who brought particularly Zen Buddhism to North America definitely participated in this kind of idea. So here on the screen, we have a little quotation from Shunryu Suzuki, Shunryu Suzuki being the Zen master that founded San Francisco Zen Center, one of the big kind of names in the introduction of particularly Zen into North America. And here, one of his students famously asked him what life is. And he said, life is like stepping onto a boat, which is about to set sail and then sink. So, you know, on the face of it, this description of what life is, or this description of how reality is that we get from Buddhism, doesn't really seem to embrace the idea of kind of hopefulness or a happy ending. And yet, what's really important about Buddhism is that it's not at all the intention of Buddhist philosophy to be a kind of downer in this way, right? That Buddhism's intention is to be life affirming, to be joyous. It's, after all, a kind of liberatory philosophical and religious system. It's supposed to free people from suffering and their hang-ups and their attachments and all of these things. And the Buddha very famously said, I only teach one thing, and that one thing that I teach is suffering and the end of suffering. Now, those of you who can count above one will probably think that's two things, suffering and the end of suffering. But this is kind of his point, is that for him, that's just one thing, right? That once we understand the truth of suffering, we also already and always understand how to alleviate suffering. It's the same thing. So this gives us a conundrum right at the start, right? How do we square this circle? How do we understand both that Buddhism comes across as being rather hopeless and rather hopeful, that it is both despairing and joyous, right? How do we square these things? And Buddhism for thousands of years, hundreds of years, thousands of years, 2.5 millennia, has been struggling to explain that. And in recent years in the West, we've had some sort of attempts at getting on board in this Buddhist sense of how to deal with crises. And the closest, maybe the closest, most pervasive phenomena we've encountered, particularly in North America, has been the mindfulness movement, the contemporary mindfulness movement. And this, I think, hasn't done as many favors with regard specifically to this question of how to reconcile hopefulness and hopelessness. And this is because mindfulness is very often glossed as a kind of a system of acceptance, where the purpose of the mindfulness practice enables us to sit amongst the flames, if you like, of the burning world, um, with great tranquility, with great equipoise, and maybe notice even how beautiful some of those flames are. But somewhere at base in this idea of mindfulness, as we've appropriated it in North America, is a kind of quietistic acceptance. Right? We accept things as they are, and in so accepting, reduce our stress and anxiety about it. Where our stress and anxiety is going to be about changing it. Right? So if we don't think about changing it, we're not going to be stressed about it. So this idea of mindfulness or Buddhism somewhat as acceptance does have some legs in the world today and has some traditional legs, right? It's definitely there. And again, I have a little quotation up here from an eminent Zen patriarch, Keizan Jokin, who's a 13th century Japanese Zen patriarch, who very famously admonished the followers of Zen, Soto Zen in particular, not to find fault with the present moment. Don't disparage the present, was his admonition. And this is like, stop thinking about the future as though there's always something wrong with now. Now is when we are. Now is where we are. So we have to deal with this. So to make matters even worse in some ways, right, that we've got this kind of problem in Buddhism of both hopelessness and hopefulness, of despair and of joy, and how do we tally these together? We've got this kind of false start, maybe, of acceptance. And then to make matters worse, there's some very explicit, high-profile parts of the Buddhist tradition. And here I'm looking at the Tibetan Buddhist tradition that have examples or slogans or sayings that directly admonish us to abandon hope. So here we're looking at what are called the Lojong, which means literally just mind training. And this is a system of practice taken to Tibet by Atisha, the very famous Bengali Buddhist master, in end of the 10th, going into the 11th century. And the mind training slogans is like the system of slogans, of which there are 59, the practice of which is supposed to help practitioners cultivate compassion and social engagement. Right? So the idea here is a kind of fashionable neuropsychological idea today. That is, the more you do something, the more it becomes you. So you practice these slogans until you become the kind of person for whom these slogans describe. They describe who you are. So one of these slogans, very famously and controversially, it's number 28, is abandon all hope of fruition. This comes conveniently after or just before number 29, which is don't eat poisonous food. I think that's an easy one to get hold of. Don't eat poisonous food. And number 27, I think, is something like confront your greatest shortcomings first. So leave the little things to the end, deal with the big things first. So you get the sense of these kind of little pithy things that we're supposed to, slogans that we're supposed to embrace and bring into our lives. And one of the most famous of them, and certainly the most controversial for us today, is this one: abandon all hope of fruition. And it's worth pausing as I repeat that: abandon all hope of fruition. Right? We pause and remember what these slogans are for. So they're not meant to describe a kind of metaphysical or even poetical vision of living in a kind of hell. So this is not Dante, right? Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. It's not what's going on. But rather, this is a kind of, the purpose of these slogans is to help us cultivate compassion, to help us live joyfully, to help us live better. So hold that in your mind and read it again. Abandon all hope of fruition. So our pesky square that keeps changing shape, I think, that we need to circle, right? So squaring the circle gets a new paraphrasing here, where we might say that the question has now become something like, how does giving up on hope that what you do now will make things better in the future, make your behavior now better. Let's try that again. How does giving up hope that what you do now will make things better in the future make your behavior better now? So to answer this question, Buddhists and Buddhist philosophers and Buddhist writers and practitioners through hundreds of years, thousands of years, remember we're going back here to the 11th century, have written really complex treatises, really difficult texts. But here in this conference today, we're interested in, at least partially in, the simple question of communicating the hope, right? Not per se understanding this often very esoteric philosophical system, but how do we communicate its force, right? So if we can accept on some level that Buddhism admonishes us to abandon all hope of fruition and means this as a way to enhance the quality of our lives now, right? How can we communicate what that means in practice? And what I want to do for the time I have left here is use some of the devices that the Buddhist tradition has used to express exactly those ideas and those concepts and those sentiments. And in particular, it's going to be here some storytelling. So rather than trying to excavate a complex philosophical text, let's look at the kind of stories that get told in the Buddhist tradition that are supposed to illustrate and persuade people of the kind of validity or the soundness of a position that seems, at least on the surface, to be kind of counterintuitive and a little bit contradictory. So concretely here, I want to talk about a couple of Jataka tales. Now, Jataka tales are, for those of you who don't know, are Buddhist texts, and they're usually described as being like the Buddha's origin stories. So if Marvel were making the film, these are the prequels. So these are the stories of the past lives of the Buddha, meaning something like they're the stories of like the trials, the tribulations, and the triumphs that the Buddha went through before he accomplished his awakening, his grand awakening, where the Buddha, remember, the word Buddha literally just means the awakened one. So there's going to be this idea that he lived a bunch of imperfect lives where he tried out all kinds of different ways to exemplify the behavior of an awakened one. And he didn't quite get it right all the time. Didn't really matter. He was testing, right? He was trying to work out how to do it, how to get it right. So sometimes he gets it right, sometimes he gets it wrong, sometimes he goes a bit overboard. One of the famous examples of him going a little bit overboard is actually on this slide now. What you see here is this is a really famous Jataka, sometimes called the story of the hungry tigress. I don't know if you know how to read these things, but this is a cave painting from about the 6th century, from the Mogao cave in northern Zhou. And this is how Jatakas have usually been preserved in pictorial form. You start in the top right over here and you read it in a kind of zigzag. So you read right to left in the top, and then you drop down to the middle, and then you read left to right in the middle one until you get to the end and you drop down, and then you read right to left on the bottom one. And this is a story of the Buddha going a little bit over the top, because this is this famous story of how in a previous life, the Buddha goes out hunting with his brothers and comes across a hungry tigress who is sitting there with her tiger cubs. So it's kind of happening around about here in the middle of the screen. The tigress is so hungry that she's going to eat her own tiger cubs. And so in order to prevent this happening, this dramatic act of kind of selflessness, which has subsequently been questioned about whether this was wise selflessness or kind of recklessness, right? That the Buddha jumps off a nearby cliff and kills himself in front of the tiger so the tiger can eat him instead. So the Jataka stories have these kind of moral shape and form, and they're often related a little bit to something like the Aesop's fables or something like that in the Greek tradition. So I want to talk a little bit about a few of these. A sort of side note here before we start, there are lots of Jataka tales in circulation. Not all of them are considered canonical. Some of them have just been made up more recently. Um, the classical tradition says there are 547 Jataka tales, and these are preserved in the Pali canons. It's part of Theravada Buddhism. Um, there have been a lot of kind of supplemental stories, folk stories, particularly from South and Southeast Asia, that are sort of associated with the Jatakas but don't fit into this canon. And then there are some contemporary stories that feel a bit like Jataka stories, but kind of aren't in that technical sense. And there's a bit of a debate in the field today around whether such kind of contemporary retellings or interpretations or just new narratives, um, whether these are simply fake Jatakas, right? These apocrypha in some way. Um, or is there a way in which there's a sort of fidelity to the spirit of the original Jatakas, that stories are being kind of adapted and retold in a way that meets a contemporary audience? That would be very much in the spirit of how the Jataka literature has developed through Asia. So to begin with then, let me give you one of those stories, a slightly contested contemporary version of a Jataka story. And I say it's slightly contested because I'm going to call him the author of this, Rafe Martin, who's a contemporary American writer. He's a storyteller, and he's a Zen practitioner of some depth and renown. Um, he he has made this little tale very popular. And you will see references to it, often actually by Zen teachers and Buddhist teachers who will call it a Jataka. Um, in his sort of first published versions of this, he said it was one of the 547 canonical Jataka tales, which it isn't. And elsewhere, he has kind of demurred on this and said that it's sort of inspired by those tales and so forth. And I don't think it really matters for our purposes today whether this is like a canonical Jataka tale or not, because it has a lot of the features of Jataka tales that people find inspiring and helpful. So um, with a slight kind of Disney like edge to it. Like there's a sort of Disney happy ending to it that I imagine appeals a lot to contemporary mentality, modern mentality. So let me give you a kind of quick summary of it to give you a sort of flavor of what a Jataka story might be like. So this story begins in his telling with a little gray parrot who lives in a forest. And we're told right at the start that that gray parrot is the Buddha. So he's actually a kind of previous version of the Buddha that in the Theravada tradition we would call the Bodhisattva, right? A Buddha to be. So the Bodhisattva is a gray parrot. He lives in the forest, and the forest catches fire. So fire is burning. The parrot sees that the forest is burning, and he starts to fly around and notice that all the other animals and plants haven't noticed that the fire is engulfing the forest, or they don't really care. They're busy with other things. So the parrot is flying around, screeching, trying to get everybody to leave the forest, trying to get them to go to the river where they'll be safe. But for whatever reason, these other animals won't or can't leave. So the parrot is kind of in despair, can see the end coming, can see literally that the world is on fire, but can't get anybody to leave. Now, there's a kind of moment here of despair and a moment of resolve. And that's a nice pairing, a nice Buddhist pairing. And the moment of resolve means rather than giving in to the despair, knowing that the parrot can't save the forest, right? Parrot doesn't think he can save the forest, but knowing that he can't save the forest, knowing that he can't save all those animals, the parrot still wants or needs to do something. So what does the parrot do? The parrot dives into the river, soaks all of his feathers in water, and then flies back over the inferno in the forest and like squeezes out his feathers so that the water rains down into the fire. And he keeps going back and forth to the river, doing this until the point of complete exhaustion and collapse. So we have to know here that he doesn't think he's putting out the fire. Little tiny droplets of water falling out of a parrot's feathers are not going to put the fire out, but he does it anyway. It's the right thing to do. So he does this until the point of exhaustion, and then we get this little kind of Disney twist that we might not have got in quite the same form in some of the classical ones, and I'll come to that in a second. And the Disney twist is something like there's a god watching this happen. And the god watches this and is so inspired by the behavior of this little parrot that the god transforms into a giant eagle, dives into the river, soaks its feathers, flies back over the forest, and extinguishes the fire with the water that falls from the eagle's feathers. And at the same time, as this water falls down onto the parrot, this is the tears of the eagle at this point, the tears of the eagle in such appreciation for the heroism and selflessness of the parrot. These tears cure all of the little gray parrot's wounds and burns, and also transform him into this beautiful multicolored parrot that we know today. So there's a kind of Aesop's fable, how the parrot got its colors kind of ending to this. So that's a kind of the arc of that is quite a Jataka tale kind of arc. It's a lovely story, and in fact, that kind of magical twist at the end is quite typical of Jataka stories, particularly those that are popular in the Mahayana tradition later. So the parrot is rewarded like for devotion and effortfulness, for doing the right thing in the face of despair, for doing it despite being hopeless. And remember that these are teaching stories, right? The purpose of the Jataka tales is to communicate these complex teachings of the Buddha to an audience that doesn't want to read the philosophical text or isn't able to. So the point is not that doing the right thing in moments of despair is going to kind of call down divine aid, right? In the manner that I know Gandalf summons the eagles to save the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings. That's not the point. The point is rather that we, as an audience of this story, recognize and identify with the way this parrot is doing well. Right? That parrot is doing the right thing. We admire him for it. So the lesson here is, if the question is how should we behave, the answer is we should behave like that parrot. So, okay, if that's one of our slightly controversial ones, let's look at two. I think I'm assuming I have about 6 or 7 minutes. Let's look at two canonical Jataka tales to see how they do with this. The first one, which I'll do really briefly because there's actually not very much written on it in languages that I can understand. The first one is from the Sinhalese Jataka Katha, which is a slightly different Jataka canon than the Pali canon. It has a few more stories in it. This one actually is 548. You may remember that the Pali Canon had 547 stories, so this one didn't quite make the cut. But here the story is called the Kalandaka Jataka, and Kalandaka is just the Sinhalese word for squirrel. And in this story, the Bodhisattva is a squirrel. There he is on the screen. He's a squirrel who's got babies. The babies are in a nest. The nest is on the edge of a forest that abuts up against the ocean. And then what's going to happen is we're going to have heavy rains, we're going to have storms, we're going to have gales and floods. And the trees are going to fall, and the nest is going to like get lost out into the ocean. So here we have a squirrel. I don't know why, but the word squirrel always makes me laugh. I don't mean to laugh at the plight of the squirrel. I'm sorry. But we have this little squirrel sitting on the edge of the ocean, watching out at this kind of endless expanse of water on which float his babies in a little nest. So they're lost. and he knows there's nothing he can do about it. So there's despair, there's hopelessness. So what does he do? He turns around and dips his tail, his bushy tail, into the ocean, and then runs into dry land and shakes his tail out so that the water kind of distributes into the land and into the air. And then he goes back and dips his tail back in the ocean and keeps doing this over and over again, trying to dry the ocean out simply by dipping his tail in and then shaking the water off. And he does this continuously all day and all night for 7 days, which is a wonderfully religious number for those of you in religious studies. So what happens after having done this? So it's a similar story, right, to the parrot story. Some kind of creature out of love and desperation is without hope, trying to create a better future by embracing what they can do in that present moment. Here, just like in the parrot story, a god shows up at this point. But unlike in the kind of Disney, slightly Disney version of the parrot story, this god just thinks the squirrel's an idiot. So the god like comes down to the squirrel and he's like, I feel a bit sorry for you because you're doing this completely pointless thing. You're wasting your time, you're wasting your energy. Your activity here is pointless, futile, and hopeless. So he chastises the squirrel. And the squirrel is really pissed off. He's like, no, God, you don't get it. You're just behaving, or you want me to behave in a way that is calculating about the future. You want me only to take action if there's hope of fruition. You want me only to love if there's hope of fruition. You want me only to be compassionate if it's going to work out. So you, God, you're wrong, and I'm just going to carry on. So the God is then duly chastised. And in that nice little kind of magical end, the god goes, "Oh yeah, you're right," and he saves the babies. But so it's a similar sort of arc, right? But with an important twist. So what here we get is remembering that the purpose of the story isn't to describe how reality works, but to direct us towards what good effort looks like, right? Purpose is to show us how much we admire and love this little squirrel because he's acting in a way that is regardless of how he thinks things might turn out in the future, not because of how he thinks things might turn out in the future. So this brings me to my last example, and then I will hush up for you. The last example is probably the most famous of the ones I'm talking about. It's called the Vataka Jataka. And this is the story of a little baby quail. And you can see the little baby quail there. This is the most famous one that I'm talking about. It's directly from the Pali Canon, so there's no doubts about whether this is canonical or not. It has all of the features of a classical Jataka, and that means, for instance, that it begins with a quotation from a verse that appears in the conclusion of the story. You can see it there on the screen, with wings that fly not, feet that walk not yet, forsaken by my parents, here I lie. That's how it begins. So it begins with a quote like that, and then we get a scene from the present moment. So from now, or from the now of the Jataka. And in that scene, we see the followers of the Buddha come to the Buddha in the present day and say, "Yo, Buddha, there's all this awful stuff happening in the world today. What should we do about it? How should we live?" So they present him often with a very specific challenge, very specific problem. And then he tells them a story as his advice on what they should do. So in this particular case, they come to him, his followers come to him and say, the world is literally on fire. So they're sitting in the forest talking to the Buddha. The forest around them is on fire and it is encroaching on the Buddha's place. And so they asked the Buddha, we don't know how to stop this fire. We don't think we can stop this fire. How should we live in the face of this? Now, some of you might recognize a situation like that. Let me give you the Buddha's own answer. It's like a paragraph, and it'll take us out of here. So he says, and I quote, once upon a time, in this self-same spot in Magadha, so right here where we're sitting now, it was a quail that the Bodhisattva came to, it was as a quail that the Bodhisattva came to life. Breaking his way out of the shell in which he was born, he became a young quail, about as big as a small ball. And his parents kept him lying in the nest while they fed him with food which they brought in their beaks. In himself he had not the strength either to spread his wings and fly, nor even to lift his feet and walk upon the ground. Then year after year at that very spot always raged a jungle fire. And it was just at this time that the flames swept down upon it with a mighty roaring. Flocks of birds darted from their several nests, seized with the fear of death, and they flew away shrieking. The father and mother of the Bodhisattva were as frightened as the others, and they flew away, forsaking the Bodhisattva. Lying there in the nest, the Bodhisattva stretched forth his neck and seeing the flames spreading towards him, he thought to himself, had I the power to put forth my wings and fly, I would. I would wing my way hence to safety. Or if I could move my legs and walk, I would escape elsewhere afoot. Moreover, my parents, seized with the fear of death, have fled away to save themselves, leaving me here alone in the world. I am without protector or helper. What, then, shall I do this day? And what we find in the story, I'm not going to read the rest of it, it'll take too long. What we find in the story is this little quail who cannot do anything, right? It's not just that he can't confront the fire, he can't do anything. Can't move his legs, can't move his wings. He saves himself and the forest around him with what he calls an act of truth. And here what we see, and I can see that ANSO 131 presenter has come on, so I must be running out of time. Here what we see is that commitment to the present moment, like the resolution of the present moment, the affirmation of the present moment, regardless of the future, that this can also be an act of intentionality. Like it can be the resolve to confront things as they are, to confront the truth as it is, and to remain present in the face of it. So you don't have to, on this model for the quail, you don't have to dip your tail in the ocean if you can't. You just have to want to do that. You don't have to plunge your feathers into the river and sprinkle the water into the fire if you can't. You just have to want to do that. And the act of truth here that the quail enacts is exactly that kind of commitment to living fully facing how things are right now. And that's kind of all we get about the resolution in this Jataka. And it leaves me with a question for you. And that is, in the situations that we're in now, what is your act of truth? And that's where I'm going to stop because I think I'm out of time in any case.